Okay, welcome to the Thread of Christian Nationalism webinar from Vote Common Good. We're so glad to have you with us here tonight. It's April 20th, and that is a day that we're going to remember in this country for a lot of us. It was just hours ago that jury in Minneapolis came back with 3 guilty verdicts for the murder of George Floyd. And this nation is appreciative of that right verdict, is appreciative of that act of accountability. We all recognize how in so many spaces and places in our world that we do not have justice. I am reminded of the notion that when there is not justice for all, then there's justice for none of us. And even in this act of accountability and the right thing having happened in this situation, that justice continues to be a world that we need to be pursuing. And so I'm Doug Padgett. I live here in Minneapolis, and people all over the world and all over this country are grateful for what's happened, especially those of us in Minneapolis for what has taken place. And this is not the end of any road. It is the beginning. And so in some ways, it makes our conversation tonight around the threat of Christian nationalism equally as important, because we know that there have been many threats to our society, threats to the goodness of our world because of misguided notions of Christian faith and American country nationalism. So we're glad that you're here. This is our third session. Stephanie Spaulding is our co-host. You can see on the screen there, and Christy Berghoff. And you're also going to hear from Amanda Tyler, and I'll say more about that in a moment, and from Brian Zahn. So it's going to be a very full night. We're very appreciative of you being with us with all that we have going on. It's, as I mentioned, session 3. Tonight, we're going to really turn our attention to what can pastors do. We've looked over the last number of weeks at what journalists see in this issue of Christian nationalism, what sociologists have seen, and tonight we talk about what activists from the Christian spaces and Christian pastors can do to respond to the radicalization of Christian nationalism in our country. And so, Stephanie, good to see you. And I know that Christy's going to say something in a minute. So, Christy, would you give us a little context here for where you find yourself and the place where you're coming from and how this lands to be so important for you?
Yeah, so I am born and raised and live in West Michigan, a little city called Holland. And we're one of the most conservative politically pockets in our state. We're also one of the most religious pockets in our state. And there's a lot of, Trump fever around here. And it's presented some challenges for pastors in the area. On the one hand, we have a lot of churches who are fully embracing Christian nationalism and in ways I've never seen before. Incredibly passionate and pushing these messages. On the other hand, we have a lot of pastors who maybe who have members in their congregation who are pushing this and talking about it. They see it spreading and growing, and it's a problem, and they realize it, but they just don't know how to address it. They're worried about losing their job. They're worried about crossing some kind of line that shouldn't be crossed as a pastor, speaking on political issues. And so it's a real struggle. And my husband and I pastor a UCC church. It's not really a problem in our church, but we speak with a lot of pastors who are struggling. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to address this. They know they cannot stand by and say nothing because the gospel message is becoming perverted with this strange mix of Christian nationalism and their faith. So I'm really interested in this topic, and I can't wait to hear, some thoughts tonight.
Great. And Stephanie, you are a pastor in Colorado Springs, and so this lands on you very real as well.
Absolutely. And even right now today, with the verdict coming out around Derek Chauvin and the murder of George Floyd, it is really, it's not disconnected when we think about Christian nationalism. And part of me is trying to navigate the pastoral aspect of being a public figure and nurturing other people through this particular moment, and what some still feel like is to come. And then also just being present as a social justice advocate, knowing that there are shoes that will drop, right? I have friends who are in legislatures across the country as well as federally. And what we saw on January 6th was just the beginning. And so my mind is also in a place of what is going to be the response on the other side, particularly for those who do not find this to be their image of U.S. justice, right? So there is going to be pushback and fallout, and a lot of that because they perceive that something is being stolen from them, that the nation in and of itself is changing in a way. So this is an interesting evening as well as an interesting time to be having a conversation around Christian nationalism.
A lot of us were deeply impacted by what we saw on January 6th when Trump supporters attacked the United States Capitol in order to prevent the certification of the Electoral College votes in order to stop the duly elected president of the United States from being certified. It was a terrifying moment. It was violent. It was called and should be called by many names, treacherous insurrection. What many people didn't know at the time and are dawning on them now is that that effort was so deeply fueled by Christian nationalism, that the people who put the plan together for the rally that led to the riot were people who were advocating narratives of Christian nationalism, that some of the people who went first in and got deepest into the Capitol and were most violent expressed specific Christian nationalist sentiments on their clothing, with their words, on their signs, and with their prayer. And there is a prayer that we're going to show you that we've shown each of the other sessions here of the Threat of Christian Nationalism webinar sessions, because we want you to understand how clearly this movement of Christian nationalism was tied to the insurrection on January 6th and how it remains a threat in our country. So this was recorded inside the Senate dais, which is the place where the Senate meets, and then up on the dais is where the certification for the election would then take place a few hours after this insurrection. So you'll see this. If you haven't seen it before, I'll just alert you that it is worth paying attention to and can be quite startling and shocking. It runs about a minute, 10 seconds long. We'll come back with some comments after that, and then I'll introduce you to our recording of our interview with Amanda Tyler from Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So here's the recording of the Christian insurrectionists using Christian nationalist prayers to justify their actions.
All the way back to the monument of DC.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen. Amen. Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you, Heavenly Father. Amen. For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs. Yes. That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Yes. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Amen. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
It is still hard for me to watch, frankly, and to hear those sentiments being prayed that this is our nation and not theirs, with a list of who the nation doesn't belong to say that this country has been born again with this insurrectionist act, that we will not allow this country to go down the road of those people, and that it's being birthed in a new white light. That is Christian nationalism articulated in prayer format by insurrectionists. And shockingly, and to my fear, it was a very familiar sounding prayer to what I've heard prayed in a lot of places and a lot of spaces. So that's what was shocking to me about it. one of our guests will be on next week, Shane Claiborne, had noted after watching that he was struck by the fact that the person articulating the prayer wanted to make sure that he took all of his hats off because he was in a sacred space. So somehow taking your hat off was the appropriate response after violence against the Capitol Police and against others and trying to cause an insurrection, that somehow the balance of power was that you would take your prayers to God with honor while you treat other people so dishonorably. It's a difficult thing. So that's partly why some of us are here. One of our guests tonight that you're going to hear from in a bit, Brian Zahn, has been paying attention to this for a very long time, has been a pastor outspoken on these issues. It can be a real gift to have him. And so has Amanda Tyler. Amanda Tyler is the director of the Baptist Joint Commission. It's a group that works to make sure that religious freedom is extended for all peoples. It's one of the great Baptist traditions, actually, in American history. She comes from that string of Baptists that were doing that kind of work. Well, she also runs an effort out of the Baptist Joint Commission called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She told us before our interview that she put this together in conjunction with other interfaith leaders because she recognized how important it was that Christians call out other Christians and don't ask for their brothers and sisters from the Jewish communities or Muslim communities or atheist communities or any other faith to speak to Christians, but that Christians speak to Christians. I think that's excellent work. That's why we're doing this work as well. And so this effort that we have going on here at Vocomic is deeply connected with what they're doing at the Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So earlier this afternoon, I will note, before the verdict came out of Derek Chauvin's conviction, Stephanie and Christy and I talked with Amanda, and here is that interview. And then after this, we will talk live with Brian Zahn and take your questions. So if you have questions or comments, you can write them in the chats if you're on the Zoom meeting, or raise your hand and we'll be able to include you as well. So here's our conversation with Amanda Tyler, the director of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. All right. Well, Amanda Tyler, nice to have you with us as our content expert for tonight. A lot of us were really awakened by what we saw in that video that we just looked at of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, of course, to the dangers of Christian nationalism. You all launched this effort in 2019, coming out of another set of conditions. Can you tell us a little bit about what was it that had you as an organization, and tell us about the Baptist Joint Commission as well, but what had you concerned about Christian nationalism to such a degree that you wanted to start an effort to get Christians to speak up against Christian nationalism?
Oh, well, thanks so much. And thanks for having me on here tonight for this really important webinar series that you all are having. So, as you mentioned, I lead an organization called Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or BJC for short. We're in our 85th year of advocating for everyone's religious freedom. And we really mean everyone. We come at this from a faith-based perspective, but we defend religious liberty not just for Baptists, but also for Buddhists, for Anglicans, and for atheists. We think that it is just as important to be able to say no to God as to be able to say yes to God, that without that ability, that your yes is meaningless. And we think it's really important to have a healthy separation from the institutions of religion and government in order to really protect everyone's faith freedom. So I give that frame to say, back in 2019, we as an organization really saw an uptick in both the frequency of instances of Christian nationalism and also the intensity. There were some deadly examples of Christian nationalism in this country, back in 2015 at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue outside of Pittsburgh, and those are just to name a few. And so we were really concerned about Christian nationalism, both in its most violent forms, which of course happened on January 6th as well, but also in their more mundane everyday forms, that we could really see it and a misunderstanding that often when we heard people talk about religious freedom, they were really talking about Christian nationalism. And so we thought it was a really important moment for Christians to take a strong stand against Christian nationalism, but also to offer some educational resources and understanding about what exactly Christian nationalism is. You know, now, I mean, here we're having a webinar series about it. I think it's a much more common phrase, although there's still a lot of understanding. 2 years ago, most people, when I would say Christian nationalism, would say, well, what exactly is that? So we saw a real important educational function and an opportunity to provide some resources for people to have some really necessary conversations in their families, in their congregations, in their communities, to better understand Christian nationalism in hopes of trying to root it out from the communities.
Can you give us your definition of Christian nationalism? Like, it's a term that a lot of us have thought about and worried about. It doesn't seem like very many people self-identify with it. Like, it's hard to find people who go around saying, like, I am a Christian nationalist. It feels like it's a description of a set of beliefs and behaviors more than a self-identifying perspective. But I'm wondering about your thoughts on that. How do you talk about it? And how do you explain the issue of Christian nationalism and the topic of Christian nationalism?
I think that's really a vital point, because we should have a common understanding about what we're talking about as far as Christian nationalism goes. And I'm going to point to the statement that's available at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. You know, the work that we did back in 2019 was about providing an advocacy platform for people who were interested in learning more and for taking a public stand. And the centerpiece of the project is a statement. And in the statement itself, we define Christian nationalism as a political ideology that seeks to merge our identities as Americans and Christians. So a few things here. You know, one, we are specifically talking in the American context. This is something that comes up. This is not particular to the United States, but in our work, we are really focusing on the American expression of Christian nationalism. And so we talk explicitly about American and Christian identities. But we also want to distinguish that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. Christian nationalism is a political ideology. Christianity is a religion. That said, you can't totally divorce Christianity out of it. It'd be great just to say, oh, this has nothing to do with Christianity. Yeah. That would be really easy, right? That's not accurate. And that's because Christian nationalism uses the narratives and the symbols, and in some cases, even the theology of Christianity to further this political ideology. But as we define Christian nationalism, it is not itself a religion. It is more about identity than religion in a lot of ways. And we get at this in one of our resources that we have available at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, a really handy one-pager that your guests last week, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, helped us put together, called What is Christian Nationalism? And we talk about how it's more identity than religion. When we define Christian nationalism, I think it's also important to say what it's not. It's not patriotism. Patriotism is a love of country, and we can show our love of country in a number of different ways. We can wave an American flag. We can protest in the streets. We can exercise our constitutional rights, right? These are all different ways to be patriotic. Nationalism is a love of country that also requires an allegiance to it above everything else, including our theological views. And so when our theological view, when our patriotism starts to ask us to sacrifice our theological views, that's no longer patriotism. That's nationalism. And particularly as we're talking about here, Christian nationalism.
Amanda, you talk a lot about this being both an ideology as well as an identity. Who is identifying in this way? Like, I don't see t-shirts that say, I'm a Christian nationalist, right? But there's a group, there's a subset of people who are identifying and carrying out the work of Christian nationalism. Who are these people?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. Nobody's claiming this label for themselves. Again, we really rely on the great research of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, sociologists of religion, who have defined the identity of Christian nationalism as carrying with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. So when they talk about, they won't call themselves Christian nationalists. They will talk about this as a Christian nation. They will talk about themselves as Christians and about the need for the country to reflect their religious values and the fact that there's some kind of providential role that God has in mind for the United States as a political entity. And all of that is carrying with it all of these other assumptions of identity that go with it. And that's why, in the statement itself, we address this head on by saying that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. It is sometimes overtly racist, and at other times it is treading in some of these, this history, this mythological history of the United States as a Christian nation that carries with it this inherent racism and white supremacy along with it.
It really does seem like there's a lot of people who believe, as a matter of fact, that this was founded as a Christian nation with intent for a Christian community to express the desire and will of God in the world. I don't know. I hear that so often from people who I think would feel totally bothered by the fact that that would be Christian nationalism. They think it's just history. They think it's just a proper description, of how the world came together. Can you talk a little bit about how do you make sense out of the history that so many people have been taught? Maybe it was in Sunday school or school or homeschool or somewhere along the line. They just picked up from, I don't know, the Pilgrims forward, that there were a bunch of religious freedom seekers that came to America to establish freedom from a oppressive government, and that was God's call. And the United States of America has a unique place, and they just view the world through God's lens, and they think God has given the people of Christian faith this land and we should be gracious to everyone. But, it was kind of a Judeo-Christian place. How do you even begin to unravel that when that doesn't feel like a choice people are making or an ideology they're picking? They feel like it's history. What advice do you have for people trying to, make some better sense out of all that?
Yeah, well, I think for one, just engaging in conversation and not taking some of this history, and sometimes I'll put that in air quotes, right? History as fact, right? You can cherry pick any kind of history of the United States. You can take different anecdotes about certain founders or constitutional framers' own religious views. You can construct a narrative as some of these Christian nationalists like David Barton have done in the past. David Barton is someone who has spent decades writing this history of the United States as a Christian nation. And a lot of this, as you said, gets into some of these curricula that homeschools and others use in order to teach this history. You can cherry pick that history. You could spend your time kind of going anecdote for anecdote or quote for quote. I don't often think that that's really a productive way to do it. And so instead, and again, I'm a lawyer, and I lead this advocacy group about religious freedom for all. So I go to our founding documents and I go to the U.S. Constitution itself. And religion or religious is mentioned exactly once in the original U.S. Constitution from 1787. In Article 6, where there says there will be no religious test for public office. And so I say, if our founders really wanted to set up a Christian nation, this was a really ineffective way to do it. To say from the beginning that there would be no religious test for public office. And then you can go to the First Amendment, of course, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But if you are saying at the very first amendment to the U.S. Constitution that we are not going to establish a religion, there shall be no law respecting an establishment of religion, again, you're not setting up a Christian nation when it comes to the laws and the structure of our government itself. It was never meant, however, for there to be a total a divorcement of religion from the public square, far from it. But as far as our government itself, our government was set up as a secular government, not one that was meant to put forward to promote one particular religion over others, or even religion over irreligion. It was set up as a secular government. I think that that's a much stronger way to kind of debate that point. And again, we have materials at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. This is, the very first bullet point, really, of our statement that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. It speaks to this issue of the right of everyone, whether they have a faith tradition or not, to engage fully as participants in our constitutional democracy.
Can you take that a little bit further? Because there are some who argue, and regardless of what side of the political aisle that they're on, that argue the problem is religion in the public square, period. And you all are Christians against Christian nationalism, not Americans against Christian nationalism, mothers against parents against Christian nationalism. It is clearly Christians against Christian nationalism. How do you speak to people who argue that we should just completely leave faith and religion out of the conversation because that's how we get to Christian nationalism?
I think it's a really important question to ask. And my answer to that is, one, I don't think that's possible, right? For all of us here on the call, our religion, our religious callings are core to who we are. And to ask us to kind of separate that from our public advocacy, I think is impossible to do. And I don't think it's a good idea, right? But I do think that we have a certain Christian view that has taken an outsized, position in public life as far as advocating for those positions. And that view often identifies with Christian nationalism. And so Christians Against Christian Nationalism is an effort to show the public another view of Christianity, a view of Christian public advocacy that is standing up for everyone's right to be in the public square, whether they hold a faith tradition or not. And so I think it's really vital to keep that public square open, but also to notice not just the right for us to be in that public square, but the responsibility that we carry with us when we go there, to treat each other with respect, to treat each other truthfully, to really show the best of our personal values and our callings of Christians, to put that into our space in the public square.
So I'm in West Michigan, and we have this invasive weed growing around here. Grows very quickly. It's this sticky, viney weed, and it kind of creeps along and kind of claims things and stakes its territory and grabs onto things. And as I'm pulling these weeds and I'm reflecting on Christian nationalism and thinking about some of the things that I've been learning through these forums and other things, I feel this sense that Christian nationalism is kind of moving in that way. And it's a little bit scary because it seems quite organized, actually, under other names. But how organized do you think it is? How high up does it go? How widespread is it? And then how can we combat that? Do we have to be organized in the same way, presenting an alternative? Do we have to work at dismantling it? What kind of approaches do you suggest or recommend?
Well, I think that you are right. I think that weed metaphor is right on, because it is pervasive, it is insidious, It is longstanding. Christian nationalism is not new. I noted that we really saw a rise in it in 2019 and had been noticing it during the Trump years. But Christian nationalism predates Trump, and it's here after Trump is no longer in office. And in fact, I think Christian nationalism dates back centuries in this country. And so it is so deeply ingrained in not just American culture, but in American Christianity itself, that it is something that will take a concerted effort over, I think many years for us to really make progress on rooting it out in many of the same parallel and yes, overlapping ways that racism is impacting our American Christianity and American culture, and it will take a long concerted effort to root it out. And I do think that the work, again, of Whitehead and Perry is so instructive in this, because when we talk about Christian nationalism, we talk about it as an ideology. I think it's much more helpful to talk about it as an ideology than to try to name certain people as Christian nationalists. There are some that are just, kind of textbook examples, I think, of people who have been so thoroughly infiltrated by it, but it is an ideology that impacts us all. And so when we think about it, I think we need to think less about kind of identifying, okay, who are these few people that we need to root out, and look more inward. Where are we manifesting Christian nationalism? When I talk on this topic, I'll give you an example. I often talk in churches, and these days virtually like this, right? And Zoom meetings with different churches. And I talk about some examples of Christian nationalism. And I'll point to things, of course, like the January 6th insurrection. But I'll also say Christian nationalism can show up in our congregations. And I'll put up a picture of an American flag on the altar. And that is an example of Christian nationalism. It's an example of, again, equating our citizenship in the kingdom of God with our citizenship as American citizens. It's also putting that citizenship on an equal level. And when it's on the altar, it raises this question of, what are we worshiping here? And so I threw out that example to say and again, this is a real driving force and why we launched Christians Against Christian Nationalism, is to provide the kind of tools to have some sometimes difficult conversations about Christian nationalism in our own communities, and to do a lot of inward reflection about where it's showing up and how can we rid ourselves in some ways of Christian nationalism, again, with a long view in mind, because this is not something that's going to, it's been here for centuries. We're not going to get rid of Christian nationalism in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and this use of symbols is really powerful. I don't think it's occasional that churches have an American flag in their sanctuary. I think it's fairly common. And I know a lot of pastors who've tried to move that flag, and the pushback they get, which takes them, back into what do we think about people who serve this country and more. So these symbols are incredibly powerful. And I think it's one of the reasons and things we should notice about why maybe Christian nationalism becomes reinforced in people's minds, is that we do all kinds of symbols, whether it's putting the American flag in a church or putting the 10 Commandments in a courtroom, or having a chaplain of the Senate or a chaplain of the House that have all been Christian chaplains, and they'll invite occasional non-Christians in, to always have had confessing or at least not Christian faith denying presidents of the United States. Like, there are all of these sources and forces of symbols that I think for someone to say, like, yeah, but this is a Judeo-Christian country. I mean, just look at all the places. Do you think it's possible to get rid of this ideology without taking on some of these really deeply held and closely held and cherished symbols? You can probably tell I'm hinting that I think it's not possible, but and I don't think it's going to work to get rid of them. So I really feel like we're in a quandary here. But do you think there's a way to do it even with these symbols around and in place?
Yeah, well, and I think part of it is just examining and asking the question. So some of these assumptions and ideas about Christian nationalism have just gone unquestioned for so long that it's going to take a while just to ask the question and to start to reflect on it. I'll give you an example. And some of the things that you mentioned here, again, a lot of the work that we do at Baptist Joint Committee centers around advocacy around the First Amendment. And we, for instance, file friend of the court briefs at the United States Supreme Court and have done that since 1947. And so I'll give you a recent example from the Supreme Court. There was a case that came to the Supreme Court that challenged the existence of a 40-foot cross on government land in Bladensburg, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. And the American Humanist Association challenged the constitutionality of this cross and the fact that the government was holding it up as an establishment of religion. And BJC in this case filed a friend of the court brief with our humanist brothers and sisters saying that, yes, this was an establishment of religion. But beyond the question of constitutionality, which in the court did uphold the constitutionality of this particular cross and really relied on its history and basically said that this was a historical relic, that it was going to be more divisive to remove than to leave it standing, and said some language in there that hopefully will protect against new monuments of this kind going up. But let me point out, and this is something we haven't really touched on, but how Christian nationalism can really harm Christianity itself. So the government in this case, in its zeal to keep this cross up, and this is like a textbook example of Christian nationalism in my book, right? That this cross was meant to stand for all war dead. So they said that this cross was not a religious symbol. They said that the cross was a generic symbol to stand for all sacrifice. And so we, as the Baptist Joint Committee, along with some other groups, said, that's offensive to our faith. The cross is a religious symbol. And if you're so tied to your Christian nationalism that you're willing to throw out, I think, the core symbol of Christianity in order to sustain it. And so I think that that's an instructive example of how we should question some of these monuments, and they might in the end up staying up and be sustained as constitutional. But just the questioning of them is useful, and I think this particular cross had gone, one of the reasons the Supreme Court found it to be constitutional is it had not gone questioned or objected to for such a long time. And so I think that's part of our calling right now, is to raise the questions and to challenge some of these assumptions.
I was going to ask you kind of what compels you. I was going to ask you what compels you, to this work. Is it to preserve the integrity of Christianity or to preserve the integrity of the Constitution? And it sounds like maybe it's both.
It is both. I think I come to this work primarily as a Christian myself, but also as a lawyer and as someone who is committed to the principles that everyone is entitled to equal citizenship here, regardless of their religious views or whether they have some. And on a personal note, my husband and his whole family are Jewish. And so I also have a very real personal sense of what this means and the kind of signals that are sent when Christianity is privileged in such a way. And there's a signal sent that if you're not Christian, that you're a second-class citizen in this country.
And you are speaking to this specifically as work, right? We have, we're 3 weeks into these conversations. We've had a journalist, we've had sociologists who are researchers and educators. This is work. This is advocacy, activism, organizing. And you talk about some of the things that others should be doing, having the conversations to raise the question. And perhaps, I don't know how many who are listening tonight are going to go back to their congregation and say, oh, let's take the flag down. Like that's, what should people be doing in this work to be against Christian nationalism? Again, I think about racism, and it's not enough to just say, I'm not a racist. You have to actively be anti-racist. what is the work of being against Christian nationalism?
Well, I'll offer a few suggestions. So one, if you go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, you have an opportunity to take anyone who self-identifies as a Christian has an opportunity to take a public stand against Christian nationalism. In just that way, to firmly say, I am a Christian against Christian nationalism. By signing the statement, you are agreeing to be publicly listed on our website. And in that way, I want to talk about some of the resources that we have. That's one of our top resources. You can search by your community, by your state, and you can see the thousands of others who have taken a public stand, and you can join with them in ways and organize on the ground and find your allies in this cause. You can also see who's not on the list and share this with them. Would you join us? Would you take a public stand as a Christian against Christian nationalism? And then, don't stop there. Like, take some of the other resources that we have. We have all of these digital resources that are easy to share. You can change your Facebook photo so you have a frame that says, I'm a Christian against Christian nationalism. You can share our one-pager. We have a 10-part podcast series that I hosted on the dangers of Christian nationalism that comes with a study guide. So you could have a small group discussion about Christian nationalism. You can share some of these resources with people in your congregation, with people in your friend group, with people in your family, who, I think a lot of us have people who are all along this spectrum of Christian nationalism in our very close social circles, and just try to start investigating and getting to some of these deeper root causes here. And I really believe that that's the way that we're going to make a difference, is really, it feels maybe inefficient in some ways. We want to have like a really quick fix, but in many ways, this is going to take conversation by conversation, like really a long-term effort of just better understanding this and just questioning some of these assumptions. Because I really believe, and that's why, we say it's Christians against Christian nationalism, but when you look at the statement itself, everything is positive. Everything is about what we are for. And these are concepts that I think can unify us against all different kinds of difference, to stand together against Christian nationalism and for what I hope is the best version of Christianity that we can put forward for our time, for our country, for right now.
Amanda, there are a lot of people who they just struggle with thinking that when someone says, what we've been saying in this webinar, what you've been saying tonight, like, hey, let's get Christianity out of our nationalism. They hear, let's remove Christianity from the public space. Like, let's not say Merry Christmas, and all of the kind of fears of cancel culture that I know people in my extended family raise around these kinds of issues. And they talked about Donald Trump bringing back Christianity to America because he will say it out loud and he'll have people praying in the White House. And while people like us are really afraid that there's a real threat of Christian nationalism, the people who are advocating Christian nationalism, the way they argue it is the government and people like all of us are trying to remove Christianity from public spaces. We're trying to silence other Christians. And even when you come out and say, well, I am a Christian, I'm a Christian pastor, for the love, like they say, but you're the kind that wants to be silent and you're allowing them to muzzle you and all of this. So do you worry at all that sometimes the very work that we try to do to get Christian nationalism to be silenced actually reinforces the very narratives that people are using to be pulled in deeper into the radicalization that happens around Christian nationalism?
Well, I think you've really touched on the first critique that I often get from people who, again, won't call themselves Christian nationalists, but are deeply aggrieved by the project Christians Against Christian Nationalism. They'll say kind of exactly, well, you're just trying to silence me. You're just trying to push me out of the public square. And at which point, back to the kind of the conversation Stephanie and I had earlier tonight, I say, well, look at our statement. Number one, people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. I'm not at all trying to push you out. I'm trying to take my place in the public square. Just because you have a right to be in the public square, so do I. You don't get a privileged right, and you certainly don't get, according to the U.S. Constitution, a right to have the government promote your religious views in different ways. That is un-American, that is unconstitutional. And so I think what people are often reacting to or feeling is a sense of loss of privilege in American life. This loss of, they have in many different ways, because of their Christian identity and often their white Christian identity, been privileged in some cases by the government itself, right? And so when we are trying to start pushing back against that, then they feel that loss of privilege, which again was never sanctioned by the Constitution or by the way that our government was supposed to be. They sense that as being pushed out, and I think it's something to grapple with. I don't, I can't, the way that they react to that. But I think the best that we can do is kind of point back to these core principles. If my taking as another Christian, if my taking a stance on this in the public square is somehow offensive to you or somehow threatens that, that's just part of living in a pluralistic country, and it's going to be difficult and it's going to be messy. But I'm not at all trying to push you out. I'm just trying to take my spot here as well and open up opportunities for others, by the way, who don't identify as Christian, that they have just as much of a right to be in the public square as people who identify as Christian.
So what we have chosen to identify Christian nationalism by using the word threat, that there's a threat of Christian nationalism in this country. I wonder how you respond to that, what you think, if that's overdoing it. I have wondered sometimes, are we overplaying it? But then I think, no, the shootings at synagogues, the shootings at mosques, the shootings at churches, the shootings in public spaces, the people say things that are rooted in Christian nationalism. Then, of course, not only the insurrection, but all of the candidates and the Congress people. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a congresswoman from Georgia, made a big to-do before she was elected that Ilhan Omar, my representative, turns out, so I have a lot of, thought about this. She said Ilhan Omar is not a legitimate congresswoman because she swore her oath of office on a Quran rather than the Bible. And the law says that you have to do it on a Bible because this is a Christian nation. So from seated Congress people that believe things, to the dangers and threats, like not just like of our Constitution, but physical harm being rooted by all this. Do you think we're overdoing it by calling it a danger and a threat of Christian nationalism? Or how do you respond to this level of worry and concern that we're bringing around these issues?
I don't think it's overblown at all, and I would just say I think we need to think about the threat not just as, for instance, the violent attempted overthrow of our government, but also the everyday threats that people feel in towns and cities across this country, people whose existence is threatened by this ideology that equates our identities as Americans and Christians, that even, when their physical safety isn't, being, which it is often, and we can talk about things that are going on in this country right now that overlap quite a bit with Christian nationalism when it comes to police brutality and other things like that. But even when our physical beings aren't being threatened, there are other pieces of our personhood, of our freedoms that are being threatened. So I don't think that that's overblown at all. And I would just urge a wide view about what this threat looks like across the country.
I know we're getting to the place of having to wrap up, but to that point, as someone who has been in this since 2019 and organizing nationally. What a part of your wider lens that you're like, oh my gosh, people are not seeing this, right? You all are just looking too narrowly at what Christian nationalism is, that if you could yell it from the mountaintop, so to speak, what would that be? What is the wider picture that people just aren't getting?
Great question. I mean, I think a lot of what we see happening is happening at the local level, the local and state level. So the big national event gets our attention. And I'll give an example, and I'm not sure if this is something that you all have or will talk about, but there's been a project, it's something called Project Blitz, that's been around for several years. And there's actually a couple 100-page playbook that this organization has distributed to state legislatures, urging them to pass laws that further a Christian nationalist agenda. And the playbook, again, these are laws that would probably be upheld by courts as constitutional exercises, but they do threaten religious freedom for all because they further this ideology in a number of different ways. That to be a true American, that you have to be a Christian. And so, for example, one of these laws that has been passed by several state legislatures mandates the posting of "In God We Trust" on public school walls in every public school in the state that has been passed. And it sends this signal to children that to be a full member of this community, that you have to trust in God, whatever that happens to mean in that particular instance. And I view that as a threat to our religious freedom for all, and not just to those who don't identify as religious. I view it as a threat to those of us who identify in the majority culture as Christians as well, because of the way that it takes our faith and cheapens and degrades it by making it an instrument of state power. So that's just like one example of some of the more mundane, everyday forms of Christian nationalism, measures that are being considered by state legislatures every year, that also provides a real opportunity for advocacy for people to stand up and say, I'm a Christian, but I'm against this kind of Christian nationalism, because I do think it's a threat, not just to our country, not just to our pluralistic democracy, but to our religion as Christians.
Well, Amanda Tyler, thank you so much for being with us. People can find all this over at Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org. Sign on. We really are so proud to have you as a partner in this effort. Thanks again for being part of this with us.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you and everything that you're doing to further understanding about this topic.
Thank you, man.
All right. Hey, that was insightful, wasn't it? Really great work. So thanks again to Amanda Tyler from the Baptist Joint Committee and all the work that she's doing. And now, Stephanie and Christy and all who are watching, we are joined by Brian Zahn, and this is awfully exciting for me. I'm a big Brian Zahn fan and have been helped so much by your work and all that you've done, Brian. So this is really great. You write on your own website, Brian, as means of introduction, if you don't mind. Brian is the founder and lead pastor of Word of Life Church, a Christian congregation located in the heartland of America in St. Joseph, Missouri. Or shall I say Missouri? I guess you can correct me on that. Missouri. That I is spelled with an E, is pronounced with an E. Is that how it goes?
It depends on if you're in southern Missouri or northern Missouri.
Yeah, that's great. And you write full-time pastor, occasional author, would-be mountaineer. Occasional author is being humble about it. You've written a number of really important pieces, including this book, Postcards from Babylon, the Church in American Exile, that I know so many people have talked so well about. All right, so Brian, you have been talking about the threat of Christian nationalism when many people that I know were not interested in it at all. People maybe even saying like, why is Brian so wound up about that Christian nationalism thing? You've been at it a long time. It has cost you a lot. Can you give us a little bit of your biography and history of this and what it's meant for you as a pastor in the heartland of America in St. Joseph, Missouri?
Yeah, when I first started talking about this, it was weird and exotic, and nobody else was. Well, here's my story in as quick as I can tell it. I come from the Jesus movement. I encountered Christ as a teenager, completely just turned everything around. I was leading a ministry by the time I was 17 that, in effect, turned into our church when I was 22. And the Jesus movement from the 70s, because of its proximity to the counterculture, sort of had it had kind of an anti-war, suspicion of establishment vibe to it. But that didn't last forever. And so I come from kind of a, subversive counterculture Christianity kind of root system, but just over the long journey, as we move into the 80s, the Jesus movement goes into the charismatic movement, which I describe as good until it wasn't. And then that led us into, kind of this word of faith, and then religious right stuff just became, normative until at age about 45. It's like an alarm clock was going off in my soul, and I woke up and I thought, how did I get here? I mean, I started off as a radical follower of Jesus, and now I'm just a Republican with a Jesus fish on my SUV, and it led to a profound, crisis, a rethinking, and it led me to taking my church in a new direction, a direction that I thought was much more faithful to the Jesus way, much more respectful of deep theological reflection and Christian history. I wasn't so naive as to think it would be easy, but I sure didn't think it was going to be as hard as it turned out to be. And along the way, we lost over 1,000 people. And that was, somebody's going to say, you're a big church, you lost 1,000 people. Every one of them broke my heart. Mm. And these were people that I really knew and loved. And maybe I'd led to the Lord and baptized their kids. Maybe I'd married them. Maybe I'd married their kids. And they were leaving saying all kinds of mean things. It was a very painful period of time. There were several issues, but by far and away, the key issue that caused people to leave was my turning away from, I'll say religious right, or just the easy assumption that to be a Christian is to be an enthusiastic Republican. And so I have, I have 15, 16 years of experience of what it's like pastoring people away from Christian nationalism. I appreciate what Amanda and others of you have noted, that no one really goes around self-identifying as a Christian nationalist. So you have to talk about it in different terms if you're going to help pastor people, because no one does that. And so anyway, you wanted some of my story. That's a little bit of my story.
Stephanie, I feel like you're about to say something.
Yes. When you talk about the almost insidious way that unintentionally you all came to be part of this Christian nationalist space, was it because of the theology that was being taught, or was it the culture happening around you all? Like, how did that happen for the congregation? Was it, again, a crisis in what you understood Jesus and Christ to be? Or was it the pressure of being particularly situated in the location that you were?
I think that there's not near enough attention given to the fact that this is a theological problem. There are other contributing factors, but I think for me, it was simply a theological failure. That until you see the kingdom of Christ as it is, the seduction toward empire is going to be almost impossible to resist. Maybe I'll just jump in, because I'll try to unpack what I'm getting at here. One of the things, and I'm just reflecting on what I've just heard, from Amanda and others. If a congregation perceives their pastor as just having been basically right-leaning conservative, and now suddenly he's turned into a politically left-leaning progressive liberal, well, all that is just, switching teams, and it makes people mad and you don't get anywhere. And that isn't what happened with me, by the way. What happened was I began to see the kingdom of Christ, and I became more Jesus-focused in my preaching. I think at the bottom of most all of this is this question: how does the kingdom of God come? Does it come by the cross, or does it come by the sword? And can you conflate the two? Well, I'm going to say, no, you cannot conflate the two. This problem of Christian nationalism, when we say it's nothing new, no, I mean, it is nothing new. It's 17 centuries old. It mutates and it moves from empire to empire because it doesn't work very well. It really doesn't work very well in ordinary nations. So, for example, if I'm in Portugal, and I'm in Portugal as often as I can be, and I see a Portuguese flag, in the corner of a charismatic church in Portugal, I just think it's benign. It doesn't really, okay, I mean, it's a Portuguese church and there's a Portuguese flag. It's mostly innocent. It's not innocent in the United States, and it's not innocent in Russia. These are powerful empires. Now, when I use the word empire, I'm not just throwing around an empty pejorative. I have something very specific I mean. Empires are rich, powerful nations who believe they have a divine right to rule other nations and a manifest destiny to shape history according to their agenda. That's what I mean by empire. In the scriptures, we discover that the living God, the God of Israel, the God and Father of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, apparently loves nations and ethnicities and languages and diversity and all of that. There's plenty of indication to support that view. What God is opposed to is empire. Rich, powerful nations that say we have a right to rule other nations, we have a right to shape history according to our agenda. The reason God is opposed to empire is it's an encroachment upon God's own sovereignty, and specifically, it's an encroachment on that which God has specifically promised to his son, Jesus Christ. As Christians, as the baptized, we should say it is Christ alone who has a manifest destiny to rule the nations and an agenda to shape, a divine right to shape the world according to his agenda. So, and the Bible, by the way, maintains a sustained critique of empire from Genesis to Revelation, particularly in Exodus, parts of Daniel, very strong, the Gospels, and maybe the crescendo is the book of Revelation itself. So, in one sense, it's the role of violence. Does the kingdom come by the cross or by the sword?
So you do squarely put this
by laying down our lives, or does it come by killing who we perceive to be the bad guys? Now,
so again, I just want to just clarify, you do squarely put this in the laps of pastors and those who are teaching theologically how they understand Christianity.
Well, yes, in the sense that we have had a theological failure, but many of these pastors have no idea that they have theologically failed. Yeah. I mean, you can do bad theology from good faith, but still you're going to have a bad result. And I don't think there's that many that I encounter anyway, Christians out there going, I'm a Christian nationalist, and how can I, destroy the country and the faith at the same time? I don't see that. It's genuine bad theology that has real life consequences. So you the first 300 years of the church, what we would clearly call the early church, just simply understood that you cannot establish the kingdom of God through violence, through killing, through war. And that's why the church simply refused to engage in that. And then they ran into a problem. They end up with a Christian emperor, which, okay, I'm going to say that what was the mistake that was made in the early 4th century with the church acquiescing to Constantine as a Christian emperor, I'm going to say two things. One, it was a mistake. Two, I think it was an inevitable mistake. I don't know how they don't make that mistake. But 17 centuries later, I think we can finally begin to learn and move away from that mistake. And so a legend arises, and I think it's purely a legend. I don't think there's any truth to the story. I think it's, I think it's a hagiographical legend, to tell how they arrived at this place where they have a Christian emperor, which you can understand how seductive that could be, because it's still seductive today. That, we are going to be able to bring about the kingdom of God because we have the most powerful man in the world is one of us. Of course, that's just never the way the kingdom comes. But the story was told that on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, you had two generals that were competing for a vacancy in the imperial purple. They both want to be Caesar, and there's a decisive battle. And the legend is that on the eve of battle, Constantine sees a vision in the sky of a cross with these words, "In this sign you shall conquer." And so then he applies the Christian symbol of the cross to the weapons of war, prevails in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, becomes emperor, and in short order, Christianity becomes the favored religion and then the state religion. Well, here's part of the problem. In this sign, cross, you shall conquer. Conquer is a euphemism for kill. So in the sign of the cross, you're going to kill. Well, you have now just completely inverted what the cross is and what the cross means. At the cross, we actually discover a God who would rather die than kill his enemies. But now we've inverted that, and now know the cross can be a symbol for our righteous killing. And so we've completely left the kingdom of Christ. And this virus of Christian empire, that's probably the term I use more than Christian nationalism, has ran through Byzantium and Russia, all through the Western powers. There was a time that that was Spain. Germany had a particularly horrific experience with that. The United Kingdom, England, very long history with that. It shows up in colonialism and all of that. And now it's most prevalent within the United States. And also, and I want to say this, also a resurgency in Russia. So Russia went through its period of communism, and I'm glad to see that come to an end, but now we're seeing a resurgence of Christian nationalism within Russia. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Putin is enormously popular with conservative Christians in Russia. And so, but if we're going to talk about what pastors can do, look, you can't treat your congregation like a Twitter following. so you're just gonna, okay. I read Brian Zahn's Postcards from Babylon, and I'm going to preach on it in one Sunday. Well, good luck. That's not going to work. If you want to just say, I'm going to expose the sin of Christian nationalism, of allegiance to empire, of complicity with militarism, and you're going to do it in like one Sunday or one series, you're probably going to get fired. The whole church is probably going to leave. You may feel good about yourself, and that may be fine, but if you really, as a pastor, want to affect change in a congregation, you're going to have to be more patient, more prayerful. You're going to have to pull away from an us versus them thing where, okay, these Trumper Christians are insidious and evil. I know it's very seductive to think that way, and it plays well on social media, but in the life of a pastor, that's just not going to work. I mean, it'll work if you just want to get fired and destroy your church. But if you actually want to pastor people, there's ways to go about it. First of all, don't announce what you're doing. Do it. Look, do what Jesus did with parables. I mean, why did Jesus tell parables? People say, well, because they illustrate truth. No, he gave parables because he didn't want to get killed in his first week of ministry. You remember at the very end of the final week, one of his disciples said, oh, you're no longer speaking in parables. You're speaking plainly. Yeah, and he was dead by the end of the week. And so that's
interesting. Right?
And what I've done is I just really rely upon Scripture and Jesus. And so you preach sermons from Daniel. You preach sermons from Exodus. You try to get people to understand Jesus versus the Roman Empire. And you start trying to, over time, what you're attempting to do is get people to see America, Christians, as a kind of biblical Babylon and not a kind of biblical Israel. But you can't just stand up and say it on the first day. Hey, everybody, I heard this podcast and it turns out America's like a Babylon, not an Israel. They don't do it like that. You do it over time, and you draw the dots as close as you think you can, and then let people connect them.
So are these lessons you learned from how you didn't do it 16 years ago, or did you try to paint the picture and pretty soon the picture became available and people were like, hey, thanks for marrying us, thanks for loving us, but you've lost.
Here's what I think, Doug, if you want to know what I think. I think I probably couldn't have done it any better. You say you lost 1,000 people. I kept 1,000. And that, to me, seems miraculous.
Yeah.
And it took me 10 years. And, I mean, yes, it really does. I mean, if you're pastoring maybe a UCC church, it might not be a problem. But if you're pastoring, a charismatic church, Pentecostal church, Baptist church, even most or many kinds of mainline Protestant churches, Methodist, Lutheran, you're going to have to be willing to suffer some loss, to take some hard shots.
Yeah.
I think it's worth it, although you kind of have to ask because I talk with pastors about this constantly. You sort of have to evaluate, am I really in a position to help move this congregation? If you were hired by that congregation 6 months ago, probably not. But if you have some equity, if people have come to see you really as kind of a shepherd, a pastor that they trust, then you maybe can embark upon that project. I'm all for it. I advocate for it. I'm outspoken about it, but I think pastors also have to be realistic about how much change they can actually bring about in their church. But the thing I want to say most, and then you can ask me whatever questions, is I do it by I've done it by just saying, what is Jesus saying? Let's follow Jesus. Let's listen to Jesus. And so it's not, hey, let's kind of become Democrats.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm doing. I mean, it's just not what I'm doing. And so in one sense, I'm not apolitical because the kingdom of God has deep political implications constantly, but I am intentionally passionately nonpartisan. You could try to. It wouldn't be hard to discern how I've been voting lately because I'm pretty upset about it.
A real Kamala Harris fan, I bet.
But it doesn't come from any allegiance to a political party. So much of my allegiance is given to Jesus Christ that I really have little left.
Brian, I think that's so helpful. And I also think about that video that we saw at the beginning where those insurrectionists stood inside the Senate and baptized their actions in Jesus' name. So sometimes when you teach Jesus, people are actually hearing Christian nationalism stuff, right? They get confused in the story of Peter with the sword trying to take someone's ear off before the cross, and they think we should make sure we have swords or bear spray or whatever it's going to be to go take the new hill. Yeah. So sometimes teaching Jesus reinforces these narratives in people's minds. Do you think, or am I? I mean, you can hijack Jesus that way. You can try to misuse Jesus that way. But I'm ready. Bring them on. I'll have the debate.
with the Christian nationalists. And we'll just say, okay, let's go to this text. Let's go to the scriptures. Let's talk about Jesus. I'm not backing off on that. I'm willing to have that debate. So you see what I'm saying?
I do.
So I'm just not going to, I'm not going to surrender Jesus.
Yeah.
To the Christian nationalists, to the religious right, to the Republican Party. But I'm just not going to. And so I think locally, the critics I had locally here in my town for the first several years, it was kind of like, oh, Brian's just, he's a progressive liberal, and all that. But now they're like, I don't know, but he's still here, and he's still pastoring in church. And he's still talking about Jesus a whole lot. And so it's causing some of them to go, well, And
just remind us, when was this? When did this sort of pivot happen in your own?
It started in 2004.
Yeah. Like during the Iraq War. Was it driven?
10 years to really move my church away from that. It took 10 years.
Wow.
I mean, some people, it doesn't take long, but it takes a long time for others. And even today, I don't stand up and ask my church who they voted for, or I don't do that. But I can tell you that our culture is a culture of kindness. And you can kind of hold on to whatever political philosophy that you want to hold on to, as long as you can do it with real kindness. And if you can't do it with kindness, then it's unacceptable in our culture. I just think people need to be realistic about what kind of change they can affect in the congregations they're leading. I don't think you should be looking at it through rose-colored glasses I did it. I succeeded in that. I changed the culture of our church, moved our church in a new direction, but at great loss, great pain. And I was doing it as the founding pastor of a non-denominational church, which, by the way, I'm not keen on non-denominational churches, but it's just what happened. I was leading this thing when I was 19. What do I know? But I wasn't going to get fired, and I wasn't going to have some bishop or whatever pull me out. So I had the wherewithal to attempt this, but it still could have just completely collapsed and become, no longer viable. That didn't happen. We're in a very beautiful place now, and I'm very glad to be what I'm doing. But I don't want to mislead anybody. It was very difficult. It was very hard. And I was doing it before it got as ugly as it is now.
Yeah.
But with the rise of Trumpism among Christians, that really didn't affect our church. I know it affected churches all over the country. It really didn't affect our church because we'd kind of already dealt with that earlier, when it was a little bit easier. It wasn't easier, but it wasn't easy, but it was probably easier than it is now.
Like you had the antibodies for that already. Hey, Christy, I know I see you're looking like you wanted to say something, or at least it seems like it. I'm just going to say, if you're in the chat on Zoom and you want to raise your hand to ask a question of any one of us, just indicate that little raise your hand and we'll let you say something. So, Christy.
Yeah, I just anecdotally wanted to say, my husband and I are church planters, and we previously were in a more conservative denomination, and we began to have this whole, kind of transformation of our faith and moving into many of the things you've been talking about, moving in that direction. And like you, we're in a church plant, but as we began to go through this slow, long shift ourselves, the preaching began to just also slowly evolve. So we were really fortunate in that situation to slowly bring that congregation along with us. Now, we also had this little thing that we did in that tradition where we would swap pulpits occasionally. And then we've gone through this change, and so has our congregation, and you forget kind of some of the older ways that you used to think, and then you're thrown into, a different congregation for a Sunday, and people are walking out, and what is going on here? What's going on at this church? But So I just as to illustrate your point again, like there's a slow movement, but to just stand up in front and say something, so boldly, can be really hard for people to hear. And I don't think it was effective at all.
I did a 6-month series on the Sermon on the Mount. 6 months, right? Just a little bit at a time, just walking through it. And I promise you, probably every Sunday, someone would come up to me and say, "Are you saying?" And they would, and I always try to say, I'm really not trying to say anything at all. I'm trying to let Jesus preach his sermon. What do you think Jesus is saying here? And, not every time, but a lot of times I would kind of disarm. So I'm letting Jesus do the heavy lifting. And I heard Amanda or some, maybe it was Doug, I can't remember who said during the earlier part that, we want to have the language of "in God we trust," in our schools or courts or where. But I challenge that like this. I just come on and say, "Oh, come on, in God we trust," and you got $1 trillion military budget. You're not trusting in God. That's empty language. So I try to deal with it by being not less radical, but more radical. How can you claim to trust in God and you spend trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons and B-2 bombers and Abrams tanks? And so what I try to do without saying it is I try to put a little pressure on people to go, well, man, that BZ, he might just be too Jesus-y for me. Mm-hmm. And that for those that are in the more conservative world, that's a problem for them. Yeah. And they're like, I thought I was the super Jesus-y one, but he's really...
he's taking that stuff seriously.
That sometimes breaks through. I'm not doing a good job communicating this. I'm just talking. It's late at night for me, but whatever.
Hey, Brian,
it's actually... No.
Steph.
Oh, no, I was going to say it's actually really great. And if no one has ever said it before, you sound very Cornel Weston right now. I
wish I could sound like him.
Wow.
But you speak about the nation and empire, and again, like the nation as empire. And I've heard both from you and Christy now. Can you talk to the church as empire itself, like the corporatization of religion, of the church? Because again, one of the things that I don't ever have to wrestle with, and I know that this can't be the reality for a lot of people, is I don't have to wrestle with whether or not I'm going to get fired, because no one pays my salary at my congregation, right? Like that is not my bread and butter. But the way in which the church has become so corporatized.
Yeah. Yes. The church and its conflation with, I'm going to use the word again, empire, but it takes on the characteristic of its host empire. And America is... It's why I see in churches so often you will have a, quote, board of elders or board of deacons or whatever language a particular local congregation uses, but they're completely just emulating the American corporate culture. Mm-hmm. And so what you do is you try to get the wealthy people in your church to be on the board so that they can inspire others to be more generous and giving and things like that, rather than really choosing those that are the contemplatives. Those that have come into a place of deeper wisdom and can help lead the church in a way that's non-reactive, non-dualistic. I think elder could be better understood as contemplative. I think that's a good way to think about that term. I pull away from that by trying to lean in to understand that we are to be countercultural, that we are to be subversive, that we're not a threat. Romans 13, I'm kind of all over the road here, but Romans 13 is probably mostly about January 6th. Paul was very concerned that Christians would get involved in violent revolutionary activity. I mean, he's already aware of kind of the the violent urge that is fomenting in Jerusalem that's going to break out in 66, and the first Jewish war is going to lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. And he just wants Christians to stay away from that. So, I don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't sing the national anthem. If I'm at a football game and we stand up and we sing I'll stand up because I don't want to get beat up, but I'll stand up and say the Lord's Prayer or something like that, But I mean, these are not secrets about me. I'm talking about these things. People know that's what I'm like. And so I'm intentionally trying to indicate in various ways that we are countercultural, that I'm rather ambivalent about America. I have to live here. My kids and grandkids are going to live here, so I want it to be prosperous and do well. But my real allegiance is to the kingdom of Christ. And that's why religious nationalism doesn't work, because for the community of the baptized, we belong to a transnational kingdom where citizenship, national identity is a philosophical accidental. It's just not part of our ontological being. So we hold it very loosely. I mean, I need a passport to be able to travel back when we could travel. But I don't have any particular allegiance to it. I just don't. And so I'm unwilling to wage war. I'm unwilling to kill on behalf of my nation. See, that's all radical stuff. And so I think a lot of what lies at the heart of this is the role of violence. I mean, are we those that follow the one who carries the cross, or are we pretending we want to use that name, but we're really following the one who bears the sword? And we're going to have to make up our mind about that. I think, I mean, it's why certainly you're not going to find me as a partisan in American political parties, because all of them ultimately believe that you should use the power of the sword to kill. And I just belong to another kingdom. Jesus said before Pilate, he said, if my kingdom is not from this world, it's not from this system. It doesn't operate according. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting. But we're not fighting. And so we are willing to die. We're following the one who is willing to die for that which he was unwilling to kill.
Hey, Brian, we're going to let one person ask.
See, this kind of language sounds more radical, doesn't it?
It does.
See, and that's where, in one sense, the pressure is put back on the critic. Oh, okay, so the Sermon on the Mount stuff really is actually serious.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, we're going to let Mary Blessing. She's going to ask a question. Mary, thanks for chiming in here. Sorry about that. I got to make this thing work for Mary. Okay, Mary, I think you can unmute yourself.
You hear me?
We got you, Mary. Hi there.
Hi. My question originated under Amanda's talk, but I can also direct it to Brian. On June 1st, 2020, the President of the United States illegally, in my opinion, stormed Lafayette Square and illegally used force to remove peaceful assembly people.
Mary, I think we lost you there, but I think we got the question. Yeah. So, do you think there's anything?
Well,
talk about that a bit.
I would say I got an echo here.
No, you don't. Fixed it. There you go.
Okay. Caesar's going to do Caesar things. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you expect out of Caesar. And probably, is it illegal? Yeah. Was it awful? It was absolutely awful. Did I speak out and criticize it? Of course I did. But I don't have lofty expectations of whoever's in the current role of Caesar. I just really don't. I want people that are kind and hopefully can act benevolently. And I understand that I'm not saying that it's all moral equivalency, but can someone actually fill the role, even as President of the United States, as a Christian. And I'm very suspicious of that. I remember when Barack Obama was campaigning in his first campaign for presidency, and someone asked him, "Can you govern according to the Bible?" And it was a setup question, And he says, "No, I don't think so, because if I did, maybe the first thing I'd have to do is abolish the Pentagon." And I super appreciated the honesty of that answer.
Yeah.
Now it got turned around by the religious right as, Obama says you can't govern by the Bible. Well, you can't establish the kingdom of God with the way of Caesar. Yeah. And I think Barack Obama had at least some understanding of the problems there. It's why his favorite theologian is Richard Niebuhr, who I would have disagreements with, but I just appreciate a guy that even knows the name Niebuhr.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
So Brian, as we mentioned, you've written.
I don't think we cannot expect the kingdom of Christ to be brought about through various versions of possessing the power of the sword. It just doesn't come that way.
Thank you for being with us tonight, Brian. Really appreciate it. Your book, people can pick up. I'm also noting someone in the chat, David Peters, who I think may have produced the documentary Postcards from Babylon about you, is
David
here.
And
David and Kathy are there. There's a documentary which you can find. So if you search for Postcards from Babylon and you want to be following this more, or brianzahn.com, you can follow Brian's things. Stephanie, Christy, thank you also for being here tonight. Next week in our fourth installment, we're going to be joined by Kristen Dumais. She's written a book called Jesus and John Wayne, and she's going to be with us next week, along with Shane Claiborne, who will give us a pastoral response to all of these things. And so on this significant night in our nation's history, it's good to have spent the night with all of you. To Amanda Tyler, of course, thank you. Christy, Stephanie, and Brian, thanks for being with us. And all of you that are in the Zoom chat and are still here with us, you're really great. And those watching online too, we appreciate it, and on the podcast. So thanks all. And we will be back with all of you all next week.